Okay, AMP1 students, in this video we're going to continue talking about the cell. So on our objectives, this video is going to talk about the structure and the function of the plasma membrane. It's also called the cell membrane. And we're also going to talk about the proteins that are in the plasma membrane and all the various functions that they can perform when they're in that plasma membrane. So I'm going to go back to our picture in our textbook, and I'm going to slide up. So in the lab portion, you had a basic function of the plasma membrane, and it was that it separates the intracellular component from the extracellular component. So it was kind of that barrier between what's inside the cell and what's outside the cell. So they use those terms intracellular for inside the cell and extracellular for outside the cell. But it has doing more than just kind of separating those two areas, inside the cell and outside the cell. It actually controls or regulates what substances can come into the cell and what substances can leave the cell. So it helps to regulate or control what can come in and out of the cell. So that's the function to remember for lecture, because that's going to be what we'll, call the function for the plasma membrane in lecture. All right, so I'm going to go down. We want to know the anatomy. So here is the picture. I'm going to enlarge it here so we can get real up close and personal. So this is just looking at the wall of a cell, and we're in this picture. We have to like zoom in, and we're going to pretend like we're using a microscope. We're going to zoom in and look at the molecules that are forming this cell membrane or plasma membrane. So you have to know a little bit of the microscopic anatomy to understand the function of this particular part of the cell. So we'll always start with the anatomy because you need to understand it before you can kind of understand its form and its structure, before you can understand the function that it has. So that's what we're going to do. So in here, you'll notice that most of the cell membrane or plasma membrane is made up of these structures here. There's like two layers of them. So this little purple ball here, and you'll notice it kind of looks like a balloon, and then it has like the two yellow tails coming off of it. Each one of those is called a phospholipid. So phospho, because this is a phosphate, representing a phosphate. And then lipid, because these two little yellow tails kind of things are representing lipids. So you'll notice, if you recall, we talked about in chapter 2 what can dissolve in water. So realize that this is outside the cell, and it's composed of mainly water. And then this is inside the cell, and it's composed of mainly water. So the way these phospholipid molecules are arranged is the part that likes water, remember it's called hydrophilic, they are facing the inside of the cell, so this watery environment, because they like water. So, and then same way with these on this side, they're facing the external water environment, the environment outside the cell. But the lipids, remember, those are the things that don't dissolve in water. They're non-polar, they don't have a charge, and and they don't like water. They're hydrophobic, so they're pointing their little tails towards the center of the cell or plasma membrane. So the reason they're oriented in this way is based on their behavior in water. So since there's a water environment outside the cell and inside the cell, the little tails point towards the center and the phosphates are on the outside. All right. So that's the majority of our plasma membrane. It's made up of all these phospholipids. And because we have two layers of them, so there's this layer and then there's this second layer here, You'll hear it referred to as the phospholipid bilayer, just meaning 2 layers. So that's a term that you should be familiar with, the phospholipid bilayer. And this is a pretty formidable barrier. So this doesn't let many things through it directly. So the only thing that can really get through here is like really small molecules. And then anything that doesn't have a charge, so like nonpolar molecules, but again, they have to be small too. So this is a pretty formidable barrier, the phospholipid bilayer. All right, so that's the main part of our plasma membrane. But we also have some other molecules that are making or part of this structure. The next one we'll talk about is cholesterol. So they have one in the square here, and there's one over here, here. So there is cholesterol located throughout the cell and plasma membrane. And its function, so this function is formidable barrier, the phospholipid bilayer. The function of the cholesterol is to strengthen this whole cell or plasma membrane. So strengthen it, keep it strong. It allows it to resist heat, things like that. So that's the purpose of having cholesterol kind of throughout the cell or plasma membrane. And then, all right, and then the other part of the plasma membrane that you should be familiar with is the glycolipid. So the reason they call it, excuse me, glycolipid is because it's part lipid, so that's part of its structure. And then the glyco is the term that refers to carbohydrate. Remember, glycogen was a carbohydrate, so glyco is a prefix for that, carbohydrate. And so this is the carbohydrate part. Then we have the lipid part. It's attached here to the phospholipid. So that's the glycolipid. And these are important on cells. You notice how that kind of sticks off the surface of the cell. So here's the external environment out here outside the cell. So it allows for the other cells to recognize it. So this is like kind of a marking on the cell that kind of helps other cells know what that cell is and identifies it. So that is our glycolipids. So those are important in cell-to-cell recognition. All right. So that is our structure. Now, if we zoom out here, the next part. So we had our phospholipid bilayer that was providing a very strong barrier. And then we had our cholesterol, which was strengthening the cell membrane, plasma membrane. And then we had our glycolipid for cell-to-cell recognition. So the last thing, I left this for last because this is the one part of the cell membrane where they can have multiple functions. So these blue structures that you see are representing proteins. So remember, proteins are very important in the body because they have so many functions. And so these proteins that you see that are embedded in the plasma or cell membrane, all will have different functions. And so we're going to talk about, or you should be familiar with, all the different ways that these proteins can function within the cell membrane or plasma membrane. All right, so let me go to our picture down here, because they did like a picture here where we have our phospholipid bilayer, and then what they did was they drew proteins embedded in this phospholipid bilayer, and then they put their functions at the top. So and this is the outside of the cell. So this is outside of the cell, and then this is inside of the cell. And so you may start seeing this term used for the fluid or the environment that's outside the cell. So extracellular fluid is something they may call it, or they may call it interstitial fluid. So that just means it's outside of the cell. And then cytosol is the fluid inside the cell. So you might see that term cytosol as well. You might be more familiar with cytoplasm. That's another, but it's part of the cytosol. Okay, so the first function that you should know that proteins have in the cell or plasma membrane is they can serve as transport proteins. So remember how I said the phospholipid bilayer is a pretty formidable barrier. Not many things can pass through. Just got to be really small or nonpolar. So a lot of substances need help getting across the plasma membrane. So there are proteins that are specific for certain substances to get across. So you can see that, well, these two kind of look like the same substances. Maybe these are smaller, but that one definitely looks different. So this is just showing like 3 different proteins and how they're helping substances get across the plasma membrane. So that's one function, is they can serve as transport proteins. They can help transport substances across the plasma membrane in both directions, in and out. And again, they're specific. So remember, proteins, just like enzymes, these are always have a certain shape. So they're very specific for certain substances. So. All right, so that's one function. The next function is they can serve as, and let me see what term they use for this. I think they called it, I'm going to try to stick with the terms. They called it cell surface receptors. So cell surface receptors. There's a lot of different ways people describe these, so we'll use what the book says. So cell surface receptors. So that means that this protein, which is blue, is able to serve as a receptor. So this is a little molecule, and it doesn't have, the ligand is just like a generic name for a molecule that binds to a protein or a receptor in the plasma or cell membrane. So for an example, whenever our nerve cell tells our muscle cell to contract, the way that it communicates to that muscle cell is it releases a neurotransmitter, which is a little molecule, and that little molecule will come and bind to a protein on the surface of on the cell membrane of a muscle cell. So that's an example of how a cell surface receptor would work and what the ligand is. So some of the proteins can serve as receptors. So we have some as transport proteins, some as receptors. Some can serve as identity markers. So that's what this one is representing. So this is where we have this looks like a carbohydrate here, sticking off the surface. So it serves as a identity marker, just kind of like our glycolipids did too. This one just isn't attached to a lipid, so they can serve as identity markers. That's just so another cell that comes along can recognize this cell based on this little structure that's sticking off the surface of the cell. So, all right, so they can serve as transport proteins, serve as cell surface receptors. They can serve as identity markers. And then here, we've talked about this in chapter 3, they can serve as enzymes. So this protein is serving as an enzyme. So remember in chapter 3, we talked about where you can find enzymes. So sometimes they're inside the cell working and functioning. Sometimes they're in the cell membrane or plasma membrane, like this one, working and functioning. So it's catalyzing this chemical reaction. Or they can be outside the cell too, and working and functioning in the extracellular interstitial area. All right, so they can serve as transport proteins, cell surface receptors, identity markers, enzymes. And then the last 2 ways that they can function in the cell or plasma membrane is they can function as an anchor site. So this would help with maintaining the structure of the cell. So there are some fibers that run through the inside of the cell, and they help to kind of maintain the structure of the cell and the shape of it. So they have to anchor themselves to certain areas. So a protein can serve as the structure they can anchor themselves to, so to maintain the normal shape of the cell. So they can serve as an anchoring site